Funding is allocated, and if it's not spent, it's recycled back into continuing programs and services for veterans. It's not lost money.
This person has caused the harm. He shut down 9 veterans' offices, allowed $1.1 billion to lapse when veterans needed help, and he says it's somebody else's fault? No, Mr. Speaker, he's responsible.
I hardly think that I need to take, or we need to take, any lessons from a party that says one thing and does exactly the opposite.
Probably the minister who faced the most attacks this year, and the file that was the most explosive, Veterans Affairs, and the minister, Julian Fantino. He's been on the losing public relations side of the vets issues for nearly all of 2014. That moment where he wagged his finger at a veteran and he said, finger pointing doesn't work with me. Then he proceeded to point his finger. Then, of course, when he was chased down that hallway, our audio dropped out there, folks, but that was just one of those critical moments where he was being chased down there. And look at this. I think we got the sound back here. His seeming indifference and questions about his competence have exacerbated this sensitive issue. Let's bring in the power panel. Veterans Affairs was a big, big issue of the year, and it will pose a big issue in the year to come. Elise, Brad, Rob, and Chris. Chris, Veterans Affairs. I mean, it's hard to call Julian Fantino a winner in this one, but how has this played out?
Well, I think, first of all, that there is the issue of whether veterans are getting the kinds of services they need. The Auditor General said, at least from the mental health services, no, they're not. It's taking too long. So let's separate that from the communications schmozzle that has taken place with Julian Fantino. When you won't come on a show like yours, when you won't answer questions initially in the House of Commons because you've been sent to go and accompany vets to Italy, I think that's a sign that you're not up to the file. They bring in Walt Natinchuk, the retired general, and then Stephen Lecce from the Prime Minister's office. I'm sorry, Julian Fantino has not communicated this well. I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah,
the big part of the problem.
And it began also with that just before the Auditor General's scathing report on that. Julian Fantino rolls out this $200 million program for mental health. It says it's over 6 years. It's actually over 50 years, and that exploded as well. Rob, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I mean, from a communications perspective, and I agree with Chris's frame, it reminds me of Elaine Bennis dancing at a Christmas party. There's a lot of wild gyrations in every direction. It's amusing at times. It's bizarre at other times, but it's not getting the job done, whatever Julian Fantino's doing. Why does this matter? It's not just the new generation of vets who are returning from Afghanistan and other conflicts with all kinds of issues that the government isn't substantially delivering on. It's that this is a government that committed, as part of their basic brand statement, that we are committed to the military and we're committed to the vets, and they haven't delivered on that. So it shows they're out of touch, and it shows that they're incompetent in terms of delivering on their key priorities. I'm not sure at this point that just changing the face of who is the minister over the Christmas break is going to actually change it for Stephen Harper. I don't understand, as we've talked about before, Evan, why, given the relatively limited amount of money that it would take for Stephen Harper to solve this problem substantively, they haven't done it. We'll see in the last budget of this government whether they decide to do so.
Veterans Affairs number 3 on the list, and Julian Fantino in the hot seat. This one, big story this year, Brad, but it will be a big story next year. What do you make of this?
It will be a big story next year. And this is, I think, where two kind of things collide in the conservative political frame. One is that they want to be seen as competent managers. They cut back on fat government, and at the same time, it actually hurt the very people that they've held up in such high regard, and that Canadians, regardless of political stripe, care and want to see good things done. Obviously, the losers here, and the Auditor General, I think, bore that out in his report. They have to wait so long to get the services that should be there. So obviously the losers, and it's not just the veterans themselves, but it's also the widows and their dependents. The winners here, without sounding overly cynical about the way this file is handled, and I agree with the way Chris framed it up, are the managers within Veterans Affairs. There's 60 managers who, between 2013 and 2014, actually fired or let go or eliminated one position per day. There's over 400 now, less people in 2014 at this time than there was a year ago. And they all got, as a bonus, $343,000. This is where the government's desire to reward people who cut back on government services and the very people that most Canadians would say deserve those services have come, unfortunately, to a head for those veterans, and that's a real shame.
Elise, Veterans Affairs, big story of the year. How did it play out in your view?
It wasn't one of, I'll be honest, it wasn't one of my top issues because I don't, or my top stories politically speaking, because I don't like the element that it is so political. It's heartbreaking to watch this grudge match take place and then the splintering of different veterans groups when they should really be together. But I'll just leave that, I'll put that out there on a personal note. This is the result of when, policy isn't functioning. You see communications like this, as Rob, I think, very eloquently described. That's what happens when it's not functioning. And also, I think that's probably stemming from one of the biggest transformative changes we've seen in a department. I mean, it's two generations of vets that you're talking about in a change. You're talking about 30 years. And I think it was very brave and very courageous of this government to tackle that issue. But no good deed goes unpunished, Evan. And I think that Brad does bring up some important points, that when you remove people thinking that there's other ways of getting the services out there, this is what you're going to be left with. And unfortunately for the government, I want to just say this is also a story of death by 1,000 little stories as well. The government doesn't necessarily understand why some of the great work that they've done.
But Elise, there's nobody left. There's nobody left in the Veterans Affairs Department.
That's not true,
you folks,
Brad.
Just last week, what Veterans Affairs have done have try to help the bleeding from not only the communications, but also from a substantive administration point to get services to vets. You folks have announced there's 41 cities where you need to find now case manager positions. That doesn't come because there's new veterans. It becomes you folks cut the offices, you cut the services on front line, and that's a major problem. And you can't just say these are a whole bunch of small little things that have happened. You're responsible for the department.
Brad, I know this is really good political haymaking for your boss, who's having a hard time getting traction against Justin Trudeau, but I want to separate it out because I find the politicking really quite nauseating.
Elise, it's about the vets.
Let me tell you something, Brad. If you had spoken to anyone at Veterans Canada, if you'd spoken to a vet, and I'm wondering if any of what you just said is actually hearsay or a suspicion, I think that you'll find that veterans there's lots of areas that they're happy with, but absolutely right. This government has not done a good job creating better access. You're seeing a lot of those issues come forward, and that's what's going to change in 2015. But if you look at 10 years ago, Brad, this country was not doing right by veterans. I'm still pretty happy with the way things are today.
And that's a hit against the former Liberal government, and I wouldn't disagree with on that, but you haven't fixed it, Elise, and you've had 9 years.
Yeah, but you know what? I think that you're going to have to start talking to vets, and you're going to have to start talking to organizations.
Hang in there. I mean, look, it has been you could tell it's been a big, hot political story. One note I will say, and Chris, you brought this up, the former chief of the defense staff, Walton Tinchuk, was brought in to help salvage this, or at least put a keel on the rocking ship that was Veterans Affairs. We have not heard almost anything from him. The only people out front have been, Minister Fantino, when he writes editorials, he doesn't do very many interviews. And Aaron O'Toole, who's not even in the department, but he was a veteran. But, it's fascinating. Why put Walton Tinchuk, a guy who's widely praised and trusted, and yet he has gone silent? And you got to wonder why. He won't go out front. We'll see what happens in the new year on that. All right. That's our third. That's a story that everyone wants to keep talking about. Energy, temporary foreign workers, vets. Those make 5, 4, and 3 of the top stories of 2014. And stories, by the way, that will be resonant in 2015. What is number 2? Find out after a short break.